Okay, as we're continuing here in chapter 5, beginning in slide number 13, we're going to talk about the characteristics of Hebrew narrative, and some of this may seem fairly familiar to you, again, if you understand stories generally, or if you ever had several English classes back in school, which most of you have, okay? So some of the characteristics, okay? You've got the narrator, okay? You've got to understand some different things about the narrator as these stories are being told, okay? Number one, since he is the one who chooses what to include in the story, he is comparatively omniscient, okay? In other words, that narrator is everywhere and knows everything about the story that is being told to us, okay? But you've got to realize also that the narrator of Old Testament narratives never shares all he knows, nor does he usually comment, explain, or evaluate during the unfolding of the narrative itself. His role, tell the story so that you are drawn into it. Again, a great storyteller will draw you into it without stopping to explain everything. Because if you stop to explain everything, it's like, okay, story time's not as fun, right? In other words, if you ever had story time and somebody explained everything, it's like it's just not as good, okay? Number two, again on slide number 14, the narrator is responsible for the point of view of the story, the perspective from which the story is told, okay? So in the end, it is presented from the divine point of view, and that's what we got to remember. So as the story is being conveyed to us, again, it's revelation, right? It's being revealed to us. We didn't know this before, okay? So it's from the divine point of view, or I like to say the God's eye point of view, the perspective that had it not been revealed to us, we would have never seen it, never gotten it, okay? Sometimes God's point of view is disclosed directly, as in the repeated phrase, the Lord was with Joseph, in Genesis 39, verses 2, 3, 21, and 23. Very often, however, the point of view comes by way of one of the characters, okay? Joseph at the end saying, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for my good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So in other words, we only find out at the very end of Joseph's story that God was working it the whole way, okay? The betrayals, the temptations, right? The rough treatment, the injustice, in other words, all that stuff that we're like, oh my gosh, what's going on with this guy? And Joseph basically says at the very end, it's kind of the punchline, God was in all of that. In other words, we've got to realize in our own lives that some of the injustice we experience and the unfairness and difficulties and inexplicable things, we're like, gosh, God's working, God is sovereign. In other words, if Joseph's story doesn't communicate anything to us, it should at least communicate this: the sovereignty of God is that God is at work in every circumstance of your life. In other words, Joseph's story is, in my personal conviction here, a great example of the fulfillment of Romans 8:28, right? God causes all things to work together for those that love him, who are called according to his purpose. In other words, if you want to see what does that look like, how do you express Romans 28? Is there an example of it? Yeah, I would say go to Genesis 37 and 38 through 50, and that's a great example of what Romans 8:28 fleshed out actually looks like, okay? So as you read the various narratives, be constantly on the lookout for how the inspired narrator discloses the point of view from which you are supposed to understand the story, okay? So jumping to slide 15, the scenes, okay? Rather than build the story around the character of any of the characters, the predominant mode of narration in Hebrew narrative is scenic, okay? The action is moved along by a series of scenes that together make up the whole, okay? Like a movie or a TV drama through a succession of scenes, okay? That is what Hebrew narrative is doing, okay? Each scene has its own integrity, yet it is the progressive combination of scenes that makes up the story as a whole, okay? Note, for example, how this happens in the opening episode narrated in Genesis 37, okay? In the opening scene, Joseph squeals on his brothers, after which you were informed of the basic reason his brothers hate him, parental favoritism again. The scene quickly shifts to two scenes in which Joseph recounts two dreams, which sets you up for the next scene where Joseph searches for his brothers but doesn't find them. Okay, then going to the next slide. This scene serves as a kind of pause in the story to make sure you understand the timing of the crucial scene. The arrival of Joseph the plot to kill, and the arrival of the Midianites. Okay, all that is divinely ordained. God is working behind the scenes in all of this supposed betrayal and all of this supposed, harshness and hard times. Where was God? Well, he was there all along, okay? Obviously, we know now that all of these difficult things that Joseph experienced were breaking him of the pride and the boastfulness and the impetuousness of youth that he had. Hey, look at me, look at my coat of many colors and all that kind of stuff. God was subjecting him to all kinds of harshness to break him so that his character would be humbled, so that when he in turn became basically second over all of Egypt, he didn't rush and destroy his family because of the harsh treatment. Had he not been broken in prison, he most likely would have not developed the character to have done that. Again, God is working in it all, okay? So the next three scenes, the plot to kill and the intercession by Reuben and the role of Judah in rescuing Joseph by selling him, the grief of Reuben and Jacob, are all interwoven with consummate skill, okay? But the point comes in the last verse where Joseph ends up in Egypt as the servant of a well-placed Egyptian official. In other words, it wasn't a coinkydink, right? God was at work in all of this. It was divine sovereignty going on all along, okay? So then if you jump to slide number 17, they talk about the characters, okay? In the scenic nature of Hebrew narratives, the characters are absolutely the central element. However, characterization has very little to do with physical appearance. So much so that if such a thing ever does appear, like Ehud being left-handed in Judges 3:15, you got to ask yourself why. Because a lot of times they're not saying, hey, the guy was left-handed, the guy walked with a limp, the guy, whatever. So when it does say Jacob walked with a limp, you got to ask yourself, why? Well, of course, we know why now, because he was broken by God. And because he was broken by God, his name changed from Jacob, schemer, conniver, shafter of his brother, to Israel, right? The people of God. In other words, when a physical characteristic is mentioned, ding, 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 right? Really, really, really important. Pay attention to it, okay? Left hand of Ehud. Really, really important, because that's the hand that he uses to grab the dagger, to stick it into the really fat king Eglon's stomach to kill him. Gross, right? But a really cool story to preach when you're a youth pastor, which I used to great advantage years ago, okay? So more importantly for Hebrew narrative are matters of status, wise, wealthy, a profession like captain of the guard, okay? Wife, cupbearer, baker, okay? Your tribal distinction, a part of the children of Issachar, okay? That's really, really important in Hebrew narrative that you need to pay attention to, okay? So slide 18 here, okay? Two features of characterization stand out, okay? First of all, characters often appear either in contrast or in parallel. In other words, when you see two characters, they're usually contrasting one another. One of the things I learned years ago in reading the great Os Guinness, he says this many times in his books, contrast is the mother of clarity, okay? When you see things in contrast, it gives you clarity. It helps you understand distinctions much better than just looking at one view, okay? One of the things I recognized in the book that I wrote, Clashing Worldviews in the U.S. Supreme Court, is contrasting conservative Protestantism with progressive Protestantism really helped me understand orthodoxy. It really helped me understand right belief, okay? When you're contrasting what we would consider right belief, conservative Protestantism, with what we would consider almost, if you would, heretical, okay, progressive Protestantism, it really helped me understand why I believe what I believe and why I don't believe certain things. It really helped me. Again, if all you do is stay in cloistered Bible studies with other Christians all the time, and you never subject yourself to opposing viewpoints, and you never allow yourself to be challenged, I submit to you, you will not grow as strongly as when you are challenged and you have to kind of go back and think through, why do I think this? Sometimes you can't always say, well, John chapter 3 verse 5 says, Okay, sometimes you have to think through even beyond chapter and verse, but why do I believe that? Okay, what helps me understand these things? Again, contrast is the mother of clarity. That's a long-winded way to get back to what we're talking about here. That's why you've got characters in Old Testament narratives, because many times it's trying to show you the contrast so you can get some clarity, okay? So the contrast between Joseph and his brothers that begins in chapter 37 lies at the heart of the unfolding subsequent narrative in chapters 42 to 45, okay? Showing the changes that have taken place in Joseph and Judah, okay? That perhaps is not necessarily taking place in some of the other brothers, okay? Characters in parallel usually happen at the second level of narrative, okay? So again, they're trying to bring you into the story of Israel. Again, the third level of narrative is the specific characters, but the second level of narrative is the Heilgeschichte, right? The salvation of history, okay? What God is trying to do to redeem a people for his name, the children of Israel, okay? So when you start seeing characters in parallel, it has something to do with that second level story going on, okay? John the Baptist is a reenactment of Elijah. And Mary's story in Luke 1 through 2 is a clear echo of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1 through 2. Okay? And then moving to slide number 19. Talking about character again. Okay? The predominant mode of characterization occurs in the character's words and actions, not in the narrator's own descriptions. So in other words, you're looking at the actions of these characters to get to the bigger meaning behind it, okay? So Joseph and Judah, how Joseph's moral character develops from negative to positive is going on there, okay? At the beginning, Joseph, as part of a notably dysfunctional family, yes, my friends, Joseph's family was dysfunctional. Okay, so we've got to understand that sometimes we over-spiritualize these biblical characters, but there was all kinds of problems going on in that family, okay? So Joseph is depicted as a spoiled brat, a talebearer, a braggart, okay? In other words, he had some issues in his own life too. His moral character comes alive in the incident with Potiphar's wife, made explicit by the dialogue and his faithfulness to sexual morality. In other words, he restrains himself from committing some form of adultery there by fleeing that situation, okay? And so again, that's where you start seeing this moral character as contrast by perhaps Reuben's character when he slept with one of his father's concubines, okay? Earlier, obviously, in the storyline there. So anyway, you can kind of see that going on. So I'm going to close right there with slide number 19.